Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I thought we could discuss how we can export data from a query in Access and generate an HTML table. Where does this come from? Well, quite simply, I was helping someone out in a forum several years ago and developed this simple code, and I thought I'd illustrate how it works. I've used it myself extensively. It's great for email content. So when you're doing Outlook automation, CDO mail, whatever flavor of email client and automation you're using, you have to create the HTML that gets emailed. Well, this was part of it. It's how can I take data from Access, generate a nice looking structure instead of just trying to tab it and do all sorts of weird things. Let's use a structure, a table, generate a table of the raw data from Access, and then concatenate that into the email we're sending off. Another use I've had with one client is we actually used it to generate HTML files that are used internally in-house. And there are other uses that can be used here as well. So today, that's what we're going to look at. How can we take table data and generate HTML table from it? And as you're going to see, it really is not very complex at all. I have an article on the subject, so per the usual, go to my blog, copy paste the code, and you're good to go. I'm just going to mention here, I've had some people mention in the past issues with copying code into VBA, and then it's all messed up and they have problems. Well, never copy the code like this. That isn't the way to do it, and it isn't the way to do it in almost any of the websites that you go to. Always use the source code, and then copy this guy. It has no line numbers. The quotations will be correct, because when I put them in my website, they are correct. So you won't have any formatting issues. So just remember that little piece here. Use the source code button to get the raw source code, and then use that in your VBA. Now let's go into the database. Very straightforward. So I have a contacts table, and then I created a couple queries, and we have a module. If you look at the table itself, like I said, just a couple bogus entries that I made. And then I made one that lists the companies within it, single column. And then I made the contacts, first name, last name. Okay? Nothing complex. And in reality, this will work with any query. It doesn't make a difference if it's a simple query or a complex query. You can have one field, as you're going to see. You can have 200. It will work equally well. And then I have the module in which I've put the code. So as you can see here is the function in question. So how does it work? Well, very simple. It takes two arguments, a query, name, and then there's this optional Boolean as to whether you want to include a header row or not in the outputted table. So it's going to come here, grab the query, evaluate any parameters if there are any, and then we have the record set, the raw data that we can start working with. It's going to start off by creating the table tags, and then if you've chosen to include the table header, and which is optional but optionally true, so normally it will be included. Then it's going to generate a T-head tag section with a new row, and it's going to create header cells for each of the fields in which it's going to put the field name. We'll see how that works in a second, but just know it's going to loop through all the fields, pulling out the field names, and it creates a header row. Then it comes down here where we're going to loop through all of our records. It's going to create the T-body, and now it's going to do the same thing. It's going to loop through the records one by one, and then it's going to loop through for each record, field by field, adding the cell with the value for that field. It's going to build a row, and then another row, and another row, and another row. Then once that's all done, it's output all the data from our table, or should I say query. Then it comes down here, it closes the T-body, closes the table, and it outputs the final result. So let's take a look at a concrete example. I just put the data here to simplify my life a little bit, but let's come up here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We'll put in our command. So print out the result of this function with this argument. So what am I doing? The argument, the query name company. So just very quickly, I have here companies is a query. So if we come back to our VBA, I'm pushing that query to the function, and I'm not adding this argument, so therefore it will be true because I'm not telling it otherwise. If we run it, you're going to get this end result. Now, we can look at this. If you're familiar with HTML, it may be very easy for you to read, but for those of you that aren't, all we have to do to validate a little bit quickly is come here and create a text file that I'm going to then change over to HTML. And yes, I'm happy with that. We're going to open this up in my text editor, which in my case is Notepad++. I will save it. And now that we have that, we can go and open it. There we go. And there you have your table. And let's now do this again, the exact same code. So let's delete this. But this time, let's override the true with false and run it again. Now let's copy this guy. Let's make a new text file. Let's edit it in Notepad. Save it. And let's open it also. Oops. Try that again. Open with. Okay. Now we've done the difference where we exported it with the optional boolean of true, and then I changed it, and instead of being optional, I switched it to false. And notice the difference right here, the header column. Okay, so true, it includes the header. What is the name of that field? False, it does not. It just outputs the records. Now, we can do another example just to show that it is flexible. Let's take the contact names. I'm going to keep the header. I think it looks nicer. And in general, I want my users to know what each column is. And then I can come back here, take my test, update it, save it, and come back here. And I can refresh the page. And there we go. Now we have two columns with all the rows. So as you saw, I changed nothing in my query. I haven't changed my function. I haven't changed the way I call it. It automatically is able to recognize the number of columns fields and the number of rows. I don't have to do anything. It will adapt whether it's 1 or 200. Now, taking things further, the one thing that some people will bring up here is, it's a table, yes, but where are my lines? Let's talk a little bit about formatting. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into formatting. This is getting into HTML and CSS, and it's going outside the scope of what I wanted to talk about today, which was VBA, and just how can we generate it. But that said, let's take a look at it together for a couple minutes. I'll show you some of the basic things, and then if you want to take it further, well, then you can use Google and do further searches on HTML, table, and CSS formatting. But I'll get you guys started in the right direction for sure. Well, there are different ways of going about formatting tables. Okay, so let's come back here. I'm just going to work in the text editor. But the same is true. You can do the same thing directly in VBA, and I'll give you a simple example afterwards. But let's just look at what we can do here. Well, the first thing we can do here is there's always the tried, tested, and true do a border of 1. And you know what? Let's put these side by side so we don't have to keep jumping around as much. Okay? And now that we've done that, and I saved my text edit, let's refresh it. And that is the default HTML border of 1. And a lot of you are going to say, well, that's not very pretty, Daniel. We can't use this in business. And I'm not going to deny that. That wouldn't be my first choice either. What else can we do? Well, one thing you can do is you can also use the style. And for that, you can then go maybe do something like this. And now it's at least starting to resemble what we'd consider more of a table. Okay? There are other parameters too that you can get into. There, I believe, it's been a long time here. Cell padding is one of them. And there's also cell spacing, which is another one. Okay? So you can get into this type of thing and see how it affects things, and try to get the look you want or don't want. Now, as you saw, 1 isn't going to do it, but if we push that up to maybe, let's say, 8, you're going to see instantaneously a little bit of the effect you're going to get. Now, there are limits to what you can do here easily, directly in line like this. And yes, you can also get into doing other things. You can apply styling directly here. You could apply styling in individual cells. You can get into that. You can get into really complex inline formatting. I'm not a big proponent of that. It makes your code very complex. You know, even your VBA code, depending on what you're doing, becomes much more complex. And the way I normally recommend is this instead. Forget formatting your table inline. And do it like you would a proper website, okay? Which is use classes, use CSS styling. So if we were to come here and do that, and then we come here and we do that, and then we come here and we do that guy. And then what we can do, let's look at just replicating. Because right now, if we've just done that, right, you're back to the default. Okay, there's no styling. So let's start, what do we have to do to get back to where we were? And then what can we do to take it even further? Well, one of the things you can do is do something like the following. Okay. And then we can take this class and we apply it to our table. And this is going to be the extent of the code that we have to do to apply anything we're going to put in our styles. We've applied a class to that table. Everything we define within that class automatically gets us assigned to the proper, whether it be header rows or individual data rows or cells, depending on how deep you need to go in all this. But let's just take a look at, all we're doing here is we're applying a basic border and collapsing it and see where that brings us. Now we're getting closer, but it isn't identical. We're still missing some of them, right? So then let's take it a little further. And then we can come and let's apply something to the header row. And apply that. And now we've got our lines in the header row. Well, what about doing our rows for our body? Well, we can similarly do the same thing. We can come and do this, right? And then depending on what you're wanting or not, you can get into doing padding directly here if you wanted to. What you can also do is you can come and say, well, I want to change my header. I don't want it to be what it is by default. I want it to be Arial. I want it to be bold. I want it to be red, let's say. So you can come here. You can change the font weight. So you can do the CSS formatting that you choose. And as you can see, it's instantaneously changed. You can get into, if you want, background color, and you can do whatever you'd like. as your HTML color. Okay. So the world is your oyster here because you can format it. You're using CSS. You can use HTML styling to your heart's content. The other nifty thing that I'm going to end on here for styling, because like I said, I don't want to make an entire course here on CSS. That isn't the point today. But just to illustrate, one other thing you can do is you can even get into doing this, where you're going to tell it for the rows in the body, because I'm not worrying about my header, but just in the body section, the nth. So it's a numerical calculation. In this case, I'm telling every odd row and every even row. And I'm going to alternate the background color. So you can do these types of beautiful layouts. Now, obviously, these are not the colors I'd use professionally. This is to demonstrate, and it's easy to see. But you can alternate white to a light gray, a light blue. You can do whatever you want to make it more legible and easier to comprehend. Okay? So this is just to illustrate to you that with a few lines here, you can control whatever. You could have 200 rows here. Imagine having to do inline formatting on 200 rows to achieve, let's say, alternate coloring, when all I had to do here was add, 6 lines. And when you're defining an email in Outlook, let's say for Outlook Automation or even CDO Mail or whatever the case may be, you can easily create this style section in the HTML that you output. So this is very easy to do. And maybe I should be doing a video on that next. But all of this to say that I can output a table, and all I need to do is modify my code to do this and include this in my email generation section, and it's going to turn out every single time perfectly. So anyway, just to highlight a little bit that you can take this output function and take it much further if you want to get the look and the feel that you want and make it professional. One word of caution, however, when you're doing any of this type of stuff, especially with anything revolving around Outlook, I've found that Thunderbird is much more flexible and accepting, but Outlook is horrible with CSS. So before you develop too much, before you put a lot of time and energy in this, make sure you test it out quickly in Outlook to make sure that whatever CSS you use, even if it's inline formatting, that it works, that it renders properly. Outlook is notorious. I've spent hours fighting with it to get things to work that work fine in Thunderbird and yet would not render properly in Outlook. So don't invest, hours, days doing stuff. Oh, it's going to be perfect because it renders in my browser, Firefox, Edge, whatever you use, and then only to find out that when you actually do your first real automation test that it doesn't. So very early on, double check in Outlook or whatever email client you're targeting. And as you saw, an easy way of working, initially at least, is doing what I did here with the text file and your browser. But like I say, double check with your email client because that's the guy that at the end of the day has to work properly. And Outlook does not handle a lot of CSS properly. It's still in the dark ages for certain things. So test. What I had mentioned to you, so let's go back quickly here. Like I said, and what I demonstrated before, if you wanted to really just do it here, it isn't any harder than doing this, right? Now, because in VBA we have the issue with double quotes, just so you know, you can get away with using single quotes in HTML. And then you can do, here we go. And now if we run this again, copy it and go back to our text file, we're just going to blow all of this away and put our text file back. And now come back to our browser. As you can see, we can get that initial look, like I said, with just the lines very easily. So you can do it directly in the VBA function if that's what you want to do, okay? But there are limits to what you can do. But yeah, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. But just as you saw, it is possible to format this and take it much further. I highly recommend you use the CSS class approach when you're generating this rather than the inline. But the choice is still there. It is yours. And I hope this finds some use to a couple of you out there. Okay, quick little bonus. I figured I had the code, so I might as well show. We've talked about exporting a query, which is typically how I've always had to do it. I don't normally work directly with a table. It's very rare that I have that need. But I have gotten emails in the past with reference to this article on my blog about how do we do it with the table. So here's how you do it with the table, and I will update my website shortly with this. It's the same general idea. The only difference, if we come back here, right, is here we're working with a query def. We have to validate the parameters, which we don't have to do with the table. So we can directly open the record set to a table instead. And I'm doing it in read-only as a snapshot because I don't need to edit anything. And the rest is the same. So now if we just do it directly with a table, we can take that, go back into our text file, and go back into our web browser, and there we go, we have it. And just as we previously had done, we can also, if we really wanted to, apply CSS or whatever it is you want to do to the table, if that's where we wanted to do it. And well, I'll just do it manually, but you could just come and it would output the result. It would output the result like so. And then when you refresh it, you'd have your basic. Or if you wanted to be fancier, like I said, you could simply do what I highly, highly recommend you all do, which is use the classes instead. And then you can get into whatever type of formatting you want. And that is where we will leave it for today. So now you'll have the option of exporting either a table or a query directly to HTML that you can then use however you need to use. Email, generate HTML files, whatever the case may be. I do hope this has been helpful. Thank you for spending a couple minutes of your day with me, and we will see you in the next video. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share as much as you can. It is the best way to support me so I can continue to do these types of videos. Thank you all. Take care.